Hello, everyone. I'm Adriana Cartoon here at Boston University, and my colleague Michael Bravo at Cambridge University Scott Polar Research Institute. The two of us are your hosts today, and we're going to begin with Michael introducing the event.
Thank you, Adriana, and I join you in welcoming everybody for our first event of this academic year. It's really wonderful to be back here, and just to acknowledge what this is an extraordinary thing we got going during the pandemic when things were so quiet and we wanted to reach out, and this is reflected in you, our audience, and our speakers who come together from a seminar that is transatlantic between Cambridge and Boston, but also much more than that, reaching the Pacific. Hannah's participation today. Greenland, two of our speakers are in Greenland. So the reach of the seminar is fabulous. One of the reasons we got this going was partly to highlight and create a forum in which we could have conversations, particularly in the humanities, because in Arctic studies, often the work of artists, including filmmakers, all kinds of art, and the humanities doesn't always have a platform. But we also, Adriana and I also felt very strongly about bringing people together across many different areas of work and knowledge. We work with scientists in my Polar Institute, or scientists are my colleagues, and we don't really much care for these artificial barriers between who does what and the silos that sometimes people put us in. I think most importantly, though, what motivates us is yourselves, the work of our colleagues. And I think what we really like to do with this seminar, at least we try, is to identify conversations and issues that have some real importance. Maybe often we might say they are emerging issues where they are topical. They might be in the news, but not necessarily. But we really appreciate hearing from our panel members because they are informed. So we invest, I guess, in these meetings also a real desire and willingness to learn from people with expertise that we don't have, to bring together really different kinds of experience and knowledge. I think you get the picture, but that summarizes, I think, what we try to do. So on that note, thank you, all of you, panel and audience, for coming together today for this theme of greening the Arctic. And the inspiration for today's session is entirely over, to you, Adriana, for conceiving this and inviting the speakers and so on. So it's credit and thanks to you very much for doing this. I must add, though, however, I'm really enthused and impressed by the importance of this panel. I was fortunate, just a little anecdote to say, I was part of a team who took a group of undergraduate students to the north of Norway just before the start of term this year, and worked closely with my colleague, Mark Macias Foria, who is an ecologist. And working together up in Sapmi, I learned a lot, really, particularly about the shrubification of the Arctic, not just as an idea, but seeing it in front of my eyes and beginning to understand what the different species tell us about that. It also, I guess, opened my eyes to how subtle and complex Arctic ecology is. I appreciated a few of the different dimensions of the profound change that's taking place. But how to describe that profound change in the Arctic is an open question. At least it requires more than one perspective. And that's, like, I guess, Adriana, what you wrote in the abstract for the session, and what we achieve by the interesting and broad selection of speakers that you've invited. So in a nutshell, I think we're on to a really important theme today, one that is not self-evident to either by the name of the topic, greening the Arctic, doesn't really explain what's at stake, I don't think. It doesn't capture the complexity. So that's why we have the opportunity here to explore it more deeply together.
Complexity, indeed, and we'll try to make things as clear and simple as we can, and that's why we draw on so many different kinds of knowledge, as Michael is saying. So I'm just going to introduce all 5 of our speakers together, and then we'll go through each one. We'll speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll all join in a conversation. So our first speaker today is Inuk Silis Høegh. He's a Greenlandic artist and a filmmaker. He's the director of an award-winning film some of you will have seen called Sume, The Sound of a Revolution in 2014, which won several film prizes. It's an incredible, wonderful film about a Greenlandic rock band in the 70s and its connection to the Greenlandic independence movements. He also has a recent new project film installation called The Greenland, which we will be hearing about and seeing some of today in our meeting. Our second speaker is Professor Ross Virginia, a polar ecologist, also works across disciplines in environmental law and policy. He's the Myers Family Professor of Environmental Science at Dartmouth. He was also, for many years, the director of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative in the U.S. State Department. So he has a lot of experience across disciplines working with polar ecology. Our third speaker is Jeff Kerby at the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge. He's also a terrestrial ecologist and a geographer of the polar regions with a lot of field experience in the polar regions. He is also an incredible photographer who publishes work in National Geographic, including one that I didn't realize was him till after I met with him afterwards, in the north of Norway, in the north of Greenland, some of the most amazing images I've seen. Our fourth speaker is Kim Neider. He's the head gardener at Upernavjarsuk Research Station Farm, an important center for Greenlandic agriculture in South Greenland, which includes an agricultural school and different kinds of farming. So he's really on the front line of knowing how to respond to the changes in the life of the Arctic. And our fifth speaker is Hannah Bradley, who with a PhD in socio and ecological anthropology. She's done a lot of field work in Alaskan agriculture. She is currently at the University of Virginia, a postdoctoral research associate at their Arctic Research Center. So we have quite a range of experience and perspectives to draw on today. And we're going to start in that order. And we'll start with Inuk, and then we'll take questions and conversation at the end.
Hi there, thanks for having me. Yeah, so a journalist once asked me about global warming. He asked me, how does it affect us Greenlanders? And I think he expected quite a different answer. They want us to answer that it's terrible, but I said, I think it was also just to provoke, but I said that I love it because I really enjoy roast lamb meat, and I'm from South Greenland, and so the possibilities that opens up with global warming for more farming and vegetables and sheep and all this was something good to me. And of course, it was also a provocation, but it has some truths in it. But anyway, I'll speak mostly with a starting point from my one of newest art film installation that's called The Greenland. The Greenland is an art film installation. It's an eternal loop film that you will see, and it follows a green color that is sneaking or invading or saving the landscape. The idea from it came from the color green to me is like something with the environmental movement. It's spring, it's plants, it's hopeful, but it's also the color of aliens. It's color of yucky contamination of Homer Simpson's plutonium stick in his nuclear power plant. So the color green has like opposing connotations. But the idea behind installation came from my fascination with the untouched nature in Greenland that we have so much of. You know, we're only 56,000 people in a huge country. And then in 2013, they were proposing a uranium mine, or rather, they labeled it a rare earth minerals mine in South Greenland, and the government wanted to annul a ban on uranium mining to get to make way for this mine. And I was very opposed to it because it's in the middle, on the top of a mountain, in the middle of the only area in Greenland where you can farm and where you can have sheep and like this, and there's possibilities in South Greenland for a lot of good things right now. So but that at the same time, as I'm like, I'm fighting for this untouched nature, and I'm out there by myself with my knife and my rifle. I'm hunting. I'm all alone. I try to remember how I got there using a lot of diesel, and I try to remember like the photos that I take and I show to you now, that the shot digitally and shown on computers that use rare earth minerals, and so all this green activism, it's very complex, and I was trying to contemplate on it in this project, uh, and so it's like based on the four elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and in four acts, and this green color is invading the landscape, very slowly sneaking into it, and I see it as I wanted the feeling in the work. I will show a little piece of video from it, that the audience should feel not at ease, like that they were like, you're not sure that you want this beautiful green color to do this thing, or you want to prevent it from doing it. And it's really kind of the same thing. I feel that we're in this boiling frog experiment on the globe at the moment, that we're kind of just accepting that we're on the verge of, with global warming, and that we're just like slowly moving towards something, but we don't really want to change. But in the Arctic and for Greenland, the prospects of global warming has been like also opening for some possibilities for us. And it's very true. I think this is very true. The quote you have in your in the poster for this talk, that we Greenlanders, we've survived for so many years because we know how to adapt, and we keep adapting. So when you ask people here about global warming, they're like, yeah, but yeah, we'll find, we'll work it out somehow. In locally, of course, there's other, there can be other worries when you think about the whole globe. And also that the Gulf Stream is probably going to stop, and it's not going to be as warm as we'd like it here in Greenland. But so this green color, is it a salvation or the beginning of the end of the world? And is it possibilities or obstruction for us Greenlanders? We've survived here for many thousands of years, adapting to seasons and to the game. But like, then what is the game? I mean, when I say game, it's what we hunt for is our game. But maybe in the 21st century, game is for us is something else. I mean, we have to play the global game. I would like to take questions later about it if possible. That is my what I have to say for now. I feel that it's like it's a very open kick in this forum, but I hope it can do something.
Thanks, Inuk. That's a great provocative opening, mind-opening, and visually beautiful. So, Ross.
Well, first off, I really want to thank Adriana and Michael for continuing this series and this dialogue around environmental humanities from a very broad perspective. There's not enough of this kind of dialogue. Particularly as a scientist, I feel that we don't engage enough with our colleagues across multiple disciplines, particularly in the humanities. So thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit and share some perspectives that I might bring. So Inuk, thank you so much for your visualization of change and the environment, and particularly talking about landscapes and mentioning the word global. So I'm going to kind of connect into that a little bit. This is my image place in Greenland that I've taken this walk many times through time. That's the Russell Glacier in the background. We're near Kangerlussuaq, Greenland. And as I've walked across this gradient and I've studied it, I've sampled it, I've measured greenhouse gas emissions from this gradient, I've looked at the vegetation, I've dug soil pits. So I've looked at it sort of from that perspective, but it's also just this amazingly beautiful image. And it shows the colors of green, different greens, which are represented by different vegetations. In the foreground is a shrub. It's a willow. This is one of the plants that is expanding rapidly northward in the Arctic into new places, increasing in stature and altering the nutrient cycling, the carbon cycle. Many things about the Arctic are being changed as these plants respond to environmental change. But as I've walked this place through time, I also, the best sensor, remote sensor we have is the human eye. And I've been able to notice that the ice sheet is changing. There's a thinning of the ice sheet in this area. The gray material sort of at the edge of the white ice sheet there, that's material deposited during the retreat of the glacier as it's warmed since the Little Ice Age. The surface of the ice is getting darker, which absorbs more sun, which melts the ice at a higher rate and fills the rivers with water. What we call the active layer, the part of the soil that's thawed each year, is increasing in depth. And that changes the amount of water and nutrients that are available to plants. And part of the greening of the Arctic is, in fact, transmitted through changes in the soil that we don't necessarily see very well. And finally, in the foreground, you can see the remains of a muskox. And it's very important to recognize the central role of animals and what animals provide both to the landscape, how they change vegetation, but to show the direct link to people. These animals are important for subsistence, for cultural uses, and for the identity of peoples of the North. So that's something that really draws both the humanities and the sciences together, is to recognize these deep connections through the land and how we use the land. And finally, I'm the older guy here trying to keep up with the student in front of me as we're charging down the hill here. And I think it's also important to recognize the role of education and youth in addressing these interactions and issues that are important to people. So one of the things that I stress in my teaching at Dartmouth is that there's not just one Arctic. There are many Arctics and many perceptions of the Arctic. And particularly for people from the South, I'm one of those, we often see the Arctic as a laboratory. It's a place where we go to study the most rapidly changing place on the planet. We can ask questions there that we can't address anywhere else. And so we're drawn to the Arctic for many, many different reasons. There are many people that will never get to the Arctic, think of the Arctic as a place of wilderness. Terry Tempest Williams, who is one of my favorite nature writers, talks about the Arctic as a place of original mind where the ongoing natural processes of life can continue without interference. Is that even really possible these days? I'm not so sure, But for many people, that's how they see the Arctic. They'll never be there, but they have an image of a wilderness for whatever that is. What's changing rapidly, Inuk talked about uranium mining, is that the Arctic is increasingly seen as a place of rich resources, rare earth minerals, oil, gas, and land-based resources as well. And finally, what's perhaps last on the list for many people living to the south, which really should be first on the list, is the Arctic as a homeland. It's a place where people have interacted with the environment for millennia, and we have a lot to learn from those interactions, and our dialogue is much richer when we start from that perspective. And finally, there's something that's new about the Arctic. We're talking about greening, talking about changes in the Arctic landscape and Greenland. Here's the Greenland forest, trees that are being planted there, brought in from the outside, and they're growing and they're thriving. What does this mean to the landscape and landscape change? It's not just natural change, native shrubs changing where they are. Humans are changing the landscape as well. And there's a whole series of questions that relate to that. So I would say that sort of the broad category of greening is deeply rooted in sort of the biggest questions in what I call Earth system science. You know, how does the world work? And one of the central questions is the productivity of the Earth in the Arctic, and we can translate that as greenness, the concentration of chlorophyll across the land and in the water as well. Is productivity increasing, decreasing, or remaining the same? Simple question, but scientists are really struggling to answer this across many disciplines. And that we do know that there is change, not always sure about the direction, but what is contributing that? A lot of the emphasis in the Arctic is around climate change and the feedbacks between land and vegetation and soils. But what's really rapidly emerging is that management and land use change are becoming important. The opportunities for agriculture and forestry in Greenland and across the Arctic are increasing. And how do we think about those changes? Who decides? What kinds of opportunities do they open for the peoples of the Arctic? So those are also questions that scientists are becoming aware of, and I hope will become more engaged in the future. So I'll stop there and see how we can unpack some of this as we move forward. Thank you for the opportunity for this opening comments.
Thank you, Ross. So next we have Jeff Kerby.
Well, I'm already very stimulated by these discussions so far, because we're asking big questions and diverse questions. It's just like, what is Arctic greening, or what does it look like? And then kind of following up is like, why do we care about that, or what does it mean? And just like like Ross said, and he articulated this really well, the Arctic is many things. There's many Arctics. It's a very diverse place. The same applies to greening here too. So there's ways that satellite remote sensors think about it, artists, field ecologists, people that are simply living in these regions and observing it. And every year we have this annual flush of green that runs northwards. And I don't know if this little video cycle is playing well, because nothing plays well in terms of video on the internet, but it shows kind of the race of green northwards and then the retreat, just 1 year in a constant loop. And we kind of take a snapshot of the green period to kind of tell us about change through time as we reflect on that. But not everywhere gets that green in the Arctic. And I just put this slide in because it was mentioned at the beginning. This is the very north coast of Greenland, with one of my colleagues, or two of my colleagues, Aka Simonsen from down south in Greenland, and Brian Buma. And we're looking for the northernmost bit of green on the planet. And this is what the very north coast of Greenland looks like. It's not particularly green, even in the middle of July. And this little flower up here in the corner is the northernmost flower on the planet. It's about 1 meter back from the edge of the north coast of the world. It took some effort to get there for us, but I can't imagine how much effort it took for that flower to get there. So we do have a northern limit of green, and it is right in all of this brown on the northern part of the world. And so that's a project I'm working on with Aka, Brian, and others. And yeah, so you have these little flecks of green in an otherwise challenging landscape. Yet animals still manage to eke out a living. Some of the largest muskox herds I've seen anywhere were out on the tundra in this part of the world. And that contrasts with, say, muskoxen seen here in Northwest Canada on Kikitarik on Herschel Island, another place I've worked that's also kind of at the center of some of this greening research. But this landscape looks a bit more green. Are we going to see the north of Greenland look like this at some point? We know that the Arctic is warming incredibly fast, and it will continue to do so. And we have an ability to look back in time by using satellites to tell us how green was the Arctic 30, 40 years ago relative to now. And we can make maps out of these satellites showing us where it's getting greener faster and where in some places it's not getting greener. So you see little specks of dark green in areas where it's changing. So we have a great tool there to look back in time to try to understand what we're seeing. And that's a pretty simple story. I just briefly wanted to bring up, what does it actually look like on the ground though? So spent maybe 15 years camping in a very similar place. And this is somewhere Ross also showed us. And you can start making comparisons of the kind of views that you see, because pictures tell very powerful stories. So yeah, this is near Kangerlussuaq, and this is what the landscape looked like in 2002 versus 2024. And you can see kind of in that distant slope, it's filled in with, at this time of year, dark shrubs. And those, as spring continues, turn green. Here's another 20-year look at the same viewpoint. This is part of an ongoing science project that I'm working on with colleagues at UC Davis and elsewhere. Again, showing the shrubification kind of climbing into the foreground here, taking over the landscape. However, if you look into the background at the kind of slope in the background, that looks pretty much the same as it did 20 years ago. So greening isn't something that happens everywhere. It can happen in different locations. And then we can start using drones and different ways of mapping to kind of look at this. So here's, that should say 2013, not 2002, but just 10 years. You can see kind of a lot of moss getting greener after a very wet summer, which kind of tricks the satellites into thinking that there's even more shrubs that are there because they can't see things that well. And we can go back a century or so. If we go to Northeast Greenland, we have photographs from 100 years ago. We can zoom into parts of the tundra that have changed by kind of playing that comparison game, and use tools that we can build to try to connect photographs to what we see in satellites. So here are these just two pictures that one was taken by Louise Arner Boyd about 91 years ago, and one was taken by me. And I noticed in this area that I'm outlining that a lot of shrubs seem to have filled in that spot. So you can draw on that landscape in those pictures and then start converting that into information that's useful for satellites to start digesting and kind of connect language from photographs into this remote sensing approach. So that tells you where in the landscape it changed. And then you can start running analyses to say, okay, like, did that place change more than the other places around it in the last 40 years? And we see this kind of darker green there, which indicates that, yeah, that's an area that's changing rapidly and not consistently over the last 100 years, more so in the last 20. So there's an acceleration of those changes. In the discussion, we can get into, there's a lot of challenges using satellites. You can measure the same thing with different satellites and get different answers, which can be perplexing, but that's a big topic to dig into. And they don't always measure things at the same level that our human eyes kind of see. So sometimes they have huge pixels that cover a whole island. I'll just finish up really with a little verbal sharing. This is the skin between the atmosphere and the soil. And Ross spoke a little bit about the importance of kind of connecting those two. And as an interface between the two, access to the huge amount of carbon that is in that soil, it can kind of mediate the temperature of the soil and what microbes are digesting and how fast. And as a place in the world that has kind of a huge amount of carbon in the soil relative to other regions. That has implications for the whole planet. So there's implications for people that are relying on herbivores that live in these regions. Hunting is a critical, important part of living in the north. And there's also all sorts of opportunities in terms of sheep farming or new things that the climate has opened up. So all of this is kind of interacting, and it's hopefully part of the conversation that we will have in a bit. And the name of the northernmost plant in the world, someone just said, the flower was an Arctic poppy, but there was actually a little green moss about a few centimeters further north. So micronate screw moss was the name of that. But I'll stop there to make sure we have time to discuss further.
Thank you. Go Moss. Okay, so our next speaker is Kim.
I come from Upamyasuk Research Station in the southern part of Greenland. It's a very small place. We're living 5 people here the whole year. And it's split in 2 parts. I work for Innovation South Greenland, but get the money from the agriculture department in Greenland. And 4 of the rest, they work from the school system in Greenland. You can only come here by boat. You take a quarter, or you can walk, take 12 hours. So there's a little loneliness here in the wintertime. My job is to testing vegetables for growing in Greenland. And actually, I find it very easy. I was growing in Denmark, and there was a lot of problem with insect and so on, but we have nothing here. So there's no growers who spray in Greenland at all. There's a production of about 50 tons potatoes and a lot of turnips. I'm testing strawberry in greenhouse, and this is a product we work with Yellowknife in Canada, especially about how much sugar they contain. And our first view is they contain 50% more sugar, so they are very tasteful. And then I grow cauliflower and broccoli and white cabbage. My job is to advise other growers how they can grow it. So this field I have here in the summertime, people can come and look here and see how they can grow it. But the biggest problem in Greenland is everything about logistic. It's very expensive to sell product from south to north here. So that is the biggest problem. This year we have problem with the ice, and maybe it's because of the climate change. It's break up in the Arctic and go against the east coast of Greenland and press in here. So this year it's already come in February, and that is 2 months earlier, and it was laying to the middle of nearly July, and that makes it colder here down here. It works like a freezer. So maybe it's getting colder here because of the climate change. I don't know. So next year we start with a project with the university in Aarhus about a plant we call Rodelio rosa, rosenrød in Danish. And it's a project about making medicine of this plant. I also take care of all the forest here in south part of Greenland. We have a forest in Narsarsuaq, or we have a test place there. And we are starting to raise 12 hectare more forest. Actually, this project is sold as carbon binding, but actually they have found out that it's not working with carbon binding in trees in Greenland. It has the opposite effect. So let's see what will happen in the future. Last winter, the sheep farmers had big problem with the snow in the mountain. And there was a lot of sheep who was catching the snow. And it's come earlier than normal. And maybe it's also because of climate change. We're working also together with Canada about growing vegetables on biodegradable plastic. And this year, I think it was the rescue because it's heating the soil temperature a lot. And I found out it's nearly 9 degrees higher temperature in the soil in the summertime because of this plastic. But maybe it's getting problem to get rid of this plastic. I don't know. That's all I have to say. But we have a Facebook site who's calling Upamyasuk Forsøgsgartneri, and you're welcome to look there.
Thank you, Kim. It is a really wonderful idea to look at that Facebook page, and you can see the incredible lushness of the vegetables they are growing there. We'll move to the next speaker. Thank you so much. Hannah.
Good morning, everyone. You can hear me okay. So yes, my name is Hannah Bradley. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I live here in Homer, Alaska, which is in south central Alaska, south of Anchorage, which is where I'm calling you from this morning, bright and early. So as a cultural anthropologist, my role is, or my interests have always been in people's relationships to the environment and their perception of change in the environment, which means that my research involves watching people interact with the environment and talking to them about their perceptions of the changes that they're understanding around them. And so I've done research in my own home region here in southern Alaska, but my current research is in Arctic Alaska. And there, the people that I am most often observing is other scientists, like our dear colleagues here gathered on this panel. And so I'm part of a larger research project that involves aquatic scientists and terrestrial ecologists and architects and landscape architects who are trying to understand the interactions between the built environment. Our research project is based in Utqiagvik on the north coast of Alaska, and the changing permafrost soils on which those cities are based. And so it's a lot of watching scientists look at things, and the focus of my research is about scientific collaboration and how scientists work together, both amongst disciplines as well as with the local communities, to try to understand what the matters of concern and how we can reach consensus and understanding of the processes that are going on. And so it's a big project, and I am but a small piece of it. So that's in the anthropology of science, and having scientists as kind of the study population, my interest in how the land is changing comes at kind of a degree of separation of how scientists are coming to understand how the ground is changing. Part of my interest in the changing ground came from previous research projects, including one focused specifically on the agricultural frontier and the imagination of the future of agriculture in Alaska. I became really interested in the question of the future of agriculture in Alaska, one, because I grew up in Alaska and have been involved in agriculture here for many years, but also because I kept seeing these many headlines that were just so sort of fantastical, of like the future of agriculture in Alaska, that there would just be this, it's a very hopeful sort of world-saving, anti-apocalyptic narrative of Alaska having this incredible agricultural future, which has elements of truth as well as these elements of fantasy and projection. And I think that one of the really interesting parts of thinking about the greening of the Arctic and the future of northern agriculture especially is about how people think about the future and how people project an imagination of the future. As several of our panelists have already noted, the future of agriculture and kind of the climate change north has elements of opportunity and hope to it that do not truly align with this fantastical imagination of a frontier, of an agricultural frontier. So my interest in visiting agricultural sites in the Arctic, which on the left here is a picture of Gardens in the Arctic, which is in Inuk Pass in Alaska. And then on the right is a hydroponic business that's actually in Anchorage, Seeds of Change. And so I was interested in, with my colleague Serena Stein, who took all these lovely photos, in looking at the kind of tension between the opportunities of agriculture as well as the increased uncertainties and different strategies of dealing with those, which, hydroponics, which is, there's a number of programs looking at, creating hydroponic vegetable stations in Arctic villages as a form of increasing food security. Contrasting that strategy with a more kind of ad hoc adaptation to changing environmental dynamics like Gardens in the Arctic, which is seeking very specifically to remain aligned with local subsistence patterns and rhythms of engaging with the environment that are already existing, versus hydroponics, which is more of a fully technologically separated from environmental change. So I highly recommend you look up Gardens in the Arctic, which is Rainey Hobson's agricultural project in Inuk Pass. And I don't know that she's quite as active in that project anymore, but she's also an author, an Indigenous author. So she has many projects going on, I'm sure. But I'd also recommend, there's another project, which this is just me plugging someone else's research. The Permafrost Grown project, which is based in Anchorage, also is an interdisciplinary group of scientists seeking to understand how the interaction between agriculture, another aspect of the built environment, and changing permafrost, and how those two interact. Again, trying to balance these, opportunities and uncertainties that come along with the increased growing days and increased soil temperatures associated with climate change. And so I want to, as kind of closing, to bring this back to some previous research that I had done. And so this part of my research comes from a project I did here in southern Alaska that was looking specifically about land management and land use decisions related to a grazing lease that's here in the Kachemak Bay area on the Kenai Peninsula. But in that project, I was again very interested in how people's perception of change relates to their land management decisions. And so the people that I was observing in that project included state land managers from Division of Natural Resources, soil scientists, cowboys. And in that, throughout the project, I was always interested to note how people noticed color and changes in color, whether that's seasonal or over time, and how perceptions of color are descriptions of change in the places in which we interact most commonly. And the color of the land and the changes of the grasses and the lichens and how that gives us a sense of the dynamics of a place over time, really underlined to me how perception of color is an embodied engagement with places that connects us to scales of change beyond our normal perception. So patterns which we perceive through color that connects us to those broader scales of change. So I like thinking about color. I think that the greening process is an important one to think about, both for its implications for people's lives and food security, as well as what it means as a kind of knowledge production that's both scientific and a very embodied connection to environment. So thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. That was wonderful. That brought us back around so nicely back to Inuk's presentation on color and perception, both aesthetically and environmentally and across disciplines, like you're all saying. Really, I mean, that's a wonderful synthesis, really, of how important and how varied not only the color is, but our ways of perceiving, the instruments we use, including our corporeal instruments, how different greens reveal so much when we're open to perceiving new things, especially using other instruments like a film camera or an artist's eye, etc. So we can open it up to, I'll just open it up to people who spoke, if you want to respond, and then we'll start also introducing questions from the audience.
I similarly was very inspired to think about many different things and start probably more discussions than we have time to finish here. And I just thought one kind of thread that caught my interest was how the greenness is really the interface of many different either problems or solutions that are occurring in a rapidly changing environment. And it really struck me this summer. I visited Southern Greenland, and I came away with the feeling of that being a place, just a hub of innovation, where things are changing and there's a lot of kind of creative problem solving, trying to find ways to take advantage of that. And whether it's, through kind of experimental work that Kim does. I mean, I was on the paper, or a recent paper that kind of articulated why tree planting is not a climate change solution if done at scale. That the net carbon benefit doesn't play out. That doesn't mean that's just the carbon story, right? There's other reasons to plant trees. If you need wood, if it's informative, if it builds community, you just don't want to do it across the entire region if you're trying to sell carbon credits. The sheep farming industry that's going on there, and the kind of greenness that you can see in those fields. I mean, there's a century of Greenlandic focused sheep farming there that was celebrated when we were there, and that was incredible to see. But it also harkens back to kind of the Norse area. Sheep farming was going there. So a lot of things happening that kind of focus in on greening. And then the natural scientists, people that are proposing nature-based solutions to like, all right, are more shrubs in the environment bad because they darken the surface of the landscape? And for various pathways that makes the soil warmer, which can then lead to more carbon being released into the environment. So people are proposing the value of herbivores, whether caribou or muskoxen as a means of removing shrubs and promoting grasslands, or perhaps, sheep farming, keeping shrubs away. So lots of things in my head. I'll stop talking. Thank you.
We can look to some of the questions in the chat.
It asks about an insight from local language and says, how is greening described in local language? Perceptions of color is one element that would be good to explore. And James comes from a Nile Valley perspective. So anyone want to say a little bit about how they situate green or greening in their local context? And I think by extension, that's important for us because there's this kind of question about whether greening is going to be many stories across the Arctic, or whether the Arctic will export a lesson to the rest of the world about greening.
I can only say when I think of the word greening, I think that what we say in Humanitic sometimes we say which is it's very lush, or it's very lush green, a very deep green, and it all it really means is this, we can say this area is really green. It just means it's really rich with plants. And I think that's a word we also use for a slow change, that areas can get more kind of a rich green. So that's the thing I can because otherwise we would use other words for landscape becoming more what do you say, rich. I don't know if there's any other perspectives.
Question: how and to what extent does greening threaten indigenous lifeways?
Well, I have from my perspective here in Greenland, it's true. There's a lot as Kim was mentioning in South Greenland, the kind of warming effect is not it's not simple. I mean, it right now what is done this year is like there's so much ice that's breaking off from the east coast and went into the fjords at South Greenland that it's cooled down the area, as well as the precipitation and the humidity in the air from all the warming around the globe is giving us more precipitation in Greenland in general, which can be a problem for plants and for other things. But the problem with the global warming of the climate, especially they have problems with it also in the North Greenland, where they are dependent on the sea ice in the winter to go fishing and hunting. And it's very, of course, unstable. We can feel it in the later years that sometimes they, when they can't go on the ice with dog sled or with snowmobile or with anything, because the ice is too thin, and they cannot sail because the ice is too thick for sailing. So they're kind of stuck and cannot do one or the other things. And in the winter time, we're very dependent on the sea. I mean, land hunting is very minimal, so it's that is a problem, and I guess there's not a simple solution, and it's also very unpredictable. But as I say, I think people adjust, but sometimes they need help. I mean, they don't have anything to eat at Christmas, or like it's a real problem in some periods.
Mm-hmm.
And in the longer perspective, the animals that they are, I think they will adapt to that. The slower changes of the game that's changing the area where they move around. they can adapt to. But this unpredictability is something different, and also the reliance on sea ice can be a problem in this.
Thank you. The unpredictability is so widely reported as being one of the main challenges. So you have even like what Kim was saying about it getting colder, and then you have drought. And I had the chance to go to South Greenland for the first time this summer also, and spoke to some gardeners and farmers, and the unpredictability is intense. And even like you're saying, the animals, polar bears are adapting by eating reindeer documented in Svalbard, so they're changing too, for sure, quickly. Look to another.
So a nice question from Ning Sun in Cambridge, which kind of links up, doesn't it? As it's about communities. Obviously, we have people invited in the panel are very well informed. Sometimes our panelists are community members. And it makes me think, Hannah, you were talking a little bit about the collaborative nature of this research. So Ning asks, she also compliments the speakers and thanks them, but she asks, I wonder what conversations may have been happening within Arctic communities or between such communities to share adaptation practices and what platforms or channels are being used. So is greening a conversation taking place within communities, in fact? And if so, is it being shared and how?
Well, let's see. In Alaska, a lot of Arctic communities, there are a lot of sort of governance structures that aid collaboration between villages, between regions, whether that's Alaska Federation of Natives or Alaska Forum on the Environment, Inuit Circumpolar Conference, and things like that. But as far as whether specifically greening has been a conversation, I think that comes out in different forums, as far as, in the food security forum, as Inuk had been speaking more broadly on the impacts of climate change on food security, as well as agriculture and food production as a strategy in that, and as possibilities for that change due to greening. And greening, I guess, comes into as part of that conversation, as well, especially I think in like northwestern Alaska and northern Alaska, questions around changes in caribou herds and as has been mentioned, herbivore patterns. There are collaborative co-management structures for caribou herds and other target species that are definitely thinking about these issues specifically. That interdisciplinary project Permafrost Grown, I think, is a good example of how scientists working with local farmers collaboratively to think through these issues. And that project has involved, again, Inuktitut Pass, because Rainy is the gardens of the Arctic of Inuktitut Pass, as well as mainly in the Fairbanks area, as well as Bethel in Western Alaska. And that project was originally designed to collaborate with counterparts in Far Eastern Russia and Siberia as well, although that's kind of fallen apart since the original conception of the project. So I think that those collaborative structures exist, and greening, maybe even when it's not a specific topic, it infiltrates these conversations through these other topics.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you bring out many points there, which is nicely informed by different communities. Thank you. And you emphasize the importance of livelihoods and food security. And anyone want to come in there from Greenland? If we were to ask about greening in Inuk or in a different kind of more urban area of Greenland, would that be a conversation?
I feel that there are communities that people use social media a lot for kind of discussing and also spreading their knowledge about how to grow plants. And I think there's a nice, in South Greenland later years a community of people that kind of like, share knowledge about how to grow vegetables and stuff. But I think it's mostly, and I suppose the sheep farmers will do it too, though that really try to make a living of it. But from the people that I know that are just maybe most as a hobby doing it, there's a lot of enthusiasm and about growing stuff and learning from each other. I'm not in concerning the hunters up north, how they adapt. I'm not really. I think they have other ways of communication that I guess they speak to each other, but I'm not quite sure how they do it, and if they have like from the government perspective, they are more aware of having to put money aside for eventual catastrophic events that can be like that the sea ice is not settling, or in this year also in South Greenland where the ice was there for so long that nobody could go anywhere, and so they're discussing how should they have be more prepared to help when these kind of things happen. That can be more and more risk of it is present at the.
There's a rather different question about the smell of the landscape changing. How does greening affect smellscapes? Since we know plants release scents, volatile organic compounds, they use that to communicate with each other plants, and with animals, including humans. How are you noticing changes on the land in the smell? Is that one kind of instrument we can use to talk about changes in the plantscape?
I can briefly answer one part of that. The smell on the tundra, it can be very soothing and pleasant to be there. But in some places, if the ground is kind of wet, it can kind of smell like poop, like there's like a lot of rotting things, and that can be this kind of carbon that's in the soil that's being digested and either turned into methane or other greenhouse gases. And so sometimes that waft of like kind of wonderful like smells that I quite like of the plants in the tundra, sometimes you get the smells of what's happening beneath those plants as well. And I think that kind of ties into that story. And it's memorable, but it is fun. It's a question I've seen asked on YouTube too. Like, what does permafrost thaw smell like? And you'll never get the same answer from anyone. So it's an interesting thing to think about. So yeah, I'm curious what others make of the smell.
Yeah, I could add to that. It's a bit like leaving your refrigerator door open a little too long. You're getting decomposition gases, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and this very organic, complex mixture that is coming off the decomposers in the organic matter of the soils. So when I talked about that, my walk and going in and out of a landscape over and over through time, that's a really great observation. It's not just about seeing change, but you can actually smell change. And that is happening at places in the Arctic, particularly as permafrost thaws and it switches from a oxygenated soil to too much water, and the oxygen is depleted, it becomes anaerobic. And that completely changes the balance of life in the soil. So what you're detecting with your nose is actually a wholesale change in microbial communities beneath your feet. So the biology is fascinating and complex. And this goes back to Inuk's comment right at the beginning. The complexity of these interactions is the challenge, is trying to figure out how things are connected and what direction they'll be going in the future.
The smell question is too fun to not chime in on. So many of my colleagues who in my current research, who are also my study subjects, they walk that line all the time, but many of them are permafrost scientists. And so their holy grail is to visit the permafrost tunnel that is at the operated by NREL at in Fairbanks. There's this tunnel. It was built in like the 50s that goes down into the permafrost way down, and you can walk down there and see all the layers. And there's like bison bones sticking out of the side, and to hear them describe the smell, this like earthy, musky, rotting but not rotting, cold scent of a different eon is like a religious. To hear them talk about it, it's like a religious experience. So I know that the scent of deep time is, you know, a very moving one. Something interesting.
That's fantastic. Now I have another place I want to go.
The Greenlandic soil have a pH about 5 to 6. So of course it gets a little sour smell when you go in and work with the soil.
Thank you.
It's interesting, isn't it? What a question about, if I can get in, a question about the sensory experience of landscape elicits. I think it's something that draws us all in. And I mean, we could extend that. I'm not suggesting we do, but it would be very interesting equally to ask whether, as ecologists or otherwise, you find the experience of the soundscape of these places altered by shrubbification or some of the other complex processes that we've been hearing about. It makes me think really about the full range of senses through which we experience the work that we do in the places that we visit. Maybe that's more than a comment, but also an expression of appreciation for the question and the answers.
Yeah. Just having visited the forest, the Arboretum in South Greenland once this summer, it was the sound that blew my mind. There was these flocks of songbirds. I couldn't believe how loud they were. I didn't expect Greenland to have the sound of little songbirds in a forest. It was very striking. Some more questions? We have one asking to clarify a bit more for non-science people how the potentially positive carbon benefits of green, that is the carbon capture that the plants are doing, compares or interacts with how it also at the same time the plants can exacerbate the loss of ice and the warming. You've talked a little bit about how they affect the soil and heat, contribute to the heating. Could we take another pass at that just to clarify for people?
I'd be happy to do a short version, or Ross might be able to do it better. He could pick up the pieces if I do a poor job. But just generally speaking, when plants grow, they store carbon in their bodies as you know, their bodies, and so that's great. It pulls it out of the atmosphere. People are planting trees in parts of the world to store carbon as wood there, and that's great. In the Arctic, the seasons are very short in the summer, and for a variety of reasons, when say leaves fall or animals die or carbon gets sent up into the Arctic by winds, it'll fall onto the ground, and then winter comes so quickly, it doesn't really have time to decompose as it would at lower latitudes. So if you start building up this carbon in the soil over 1,000 years or 10,000 years or 100,000 years, you have a huge amount of carbon that was pulled out of the atmosphere at one point that's just sitting in the ground. And that's great if it sits there from the global carbon cycle perspective. However, then you can start thinking of things like albedo, kind of how the energy of the system works. And you can think of that like, I'm wearing a black shirt right now. If it was a very sunny day in the summer and I was wearing a black shirt, I would feel warmer than if I was wearing a white shirt, because the white shirt would bounce some of that energy away more than the black shirt. And this happens with shrubs. It's kind of darker in winter, especially. They can poke above the snow and capture that energy and then kind of take the snow away to allow the ground to get colder. Because snow in winter actually keeps the ground warmer. It's like a blanket keeping the very, very cold air away from the kind of warmer soil. So we we want essentially to have colder soil and a darker surface can get energy in the form of heat into the soil and allow those microbes to start digesting the huge amounts of carbon that are currently residing there. So it's a balance of, it pulls a little bit of carbon out, but due to the energy balance of radiation, it will most likely release more carbon from the soil in the long run. That's the short version.
Yeah, and that's a great version, Jeff. Thank you. Yeah, the real challenge, if you're really thinking about sort of the political implications of this, we're trying to regulate the carbon content in the atmosphere. We have the COP meetings going on right now and the Paris Accord and all these things. And there's as much carbon stored in Arctic soils as there is carbon in the atmosphere. So any small thing that we do to tip the balance between what Arctic plants capture and what Arctic soils release back to the atmosphere has huge implications for the future of Earth and in terms of future warming. And the challenge we have right now is that the atmospheric warming is being transmitted into the permafrost, and we're unlocking frozen carbon, been frozen away from biological activity for millennia. And now that carbon is being suddenly activated by microbes at temperatures are above freezing. And, it's like ice cream to them. They're just munching away and they're respiring that carbon that had been stored in the soil into the atmosphere, which then increases temperature, which increases more thaw in the soil. So we have a number of these sort of biophysical potential positive feedbacks where change begets more change. And are we at a tipping point? We don't know exactly, but Jeff's recent work has really shown that planting and trying to store biomass in the Arctic in woody plants, and if you have to manipulate the system to do that, is probably not the way to go, because you disturb the soil and then you increase carbon loss from there. So it's back to Inuk's initial complexity issue. We need to know a lot more, but there's no quick answer on this one. And manipulating Arctic ecosystems to gain carbon is a very risky business, in my opinion.
Thank you. Those are great answers. We have a question from Ruth McClellan, who is a former speaker in the series. Ruth, hello. And she says, hearing about growing potatoes and turnips and sheep farming reminds me of the collective farms in the European Arctic and the Soviet Union and the legacy of these today. I came across a dairy farm in the tundra on the North Kola Peninsula. Ruth, did you have a question about reflecting on the former Soviet farms and the ones we're hearing about?
No, but I wondered whether, before the war, whether there was much communication about that. There was a little bit of a chat about that, but yeah, I was really shocked to find, in the middle of the tundra, a bunch of cows on a very, very it looked like it could have been in the Alps or something. But there were no trees. There was just this grass and cows, and the dairy and the milk from there was being turned into cheese and being sold locally. So and they were making a living from it. I mean, it was a commercial enterprise. So, and it was a kind of it had been inherited from it was, obviously it was only like 10 years ago, not quite 10 years ago, 8 years ago. So it wasn't Soviet, but it had been a collective farm and then it had been privatized. And so I think there are lots of these across in Europe, in the European Arctic. Obviously it's warmer there because they have because it's the Barents Sea, and so there's the Gulf Stream, and it doesn't have permafrost, so it's quite different kind of growing. But I wondered whether there was much exchange or had been much exchange with scientists who were working on agriculture, Arctic agriculture in Russia and in Greenland and Alaska and Canada and wherever else that's happening.
I know Ross has done some work on the effects of the Russian invasion on Ukraine and the loss of communication between Russian scientists and other Arctic scientists and how that's adversely affecting the science. Maybe Ross, you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, that is a huge challenge right now because, half of the Arctic geographically is Russia. And there had been a tradition, at least among scientists, in trying to collaborate across institutions on a whole range of problems. And most of those collaborations, the formal ones, have been shut off by the response to the invasion of Ukraine. So this is a dangerous time for the Arctic in the sense that change is rapid. Russia's half the Arctic, and we don't have open communication. We have to rely on our satellites and modeling and individual scientists working together. But the coordinated programs, there weren't a lot, but there were some that were important, are basically shut down right now. And it's not clear when that can start up again. So it behooves us to really, the rest of us, to work together as much as possible to transmit particularly local knowledge about agriculture and, like you say, the legacy of past land uses, because those experiments were done decades ago. And that's really what we want to understand. I remember being up in Fairbanks, Alaska, and Terry Chapin, a really famous scientist, took me for a walk out into this place that had been plowed and potatoes had been planted. And it was a failure, right? This is many years ago, and it came back to black spruce trees, it came back to woody vegetation. But then with permafrost thaw, those trees, which had established themselves in sort of upright, as the permafrost thawed, they lost their support in the unfrozen soil, and they all fall on top of each other. And they call it the drunken forest. It's a common appearance in the Arctic. If you see trees all tangled together, probably means that the permafrost has been thawing. And so it was quite instructive to think about, well, the reason that this black spruce forest was all tangled together now and in decline was because it actually had invaded a previous agricultural manipulation many decades earlier. So we have all these natural experiments that we need to think about taking advantage of, and communities are the knowledge holders of these kinds of things, right? That's why it's so important that we change the way we do our science and we co-produce knowledge with local communities, and we ask questions that are relevant to them, because they often will get back to the kinds of things you just mentioned. What was done there before, and why was it stopped, or what are the consequences of that past use for life today? Great questions.
We have a couple of technical questions. I'm gonna just look at one of the last questions from Ragnhild Holman Bjornsson, asking more about the potential of rock dust, Greenland rock dust, to capture CO2, which is one of the climate mitigation technologies people have been talking about. I wondered if any of the, I wondered if any of the speakers wanted to, I think that was one of the, that's been tried, right? People have been experimenting with that in Greenland. Was Inuk Rosing one of the people behind that prop? Inuk, do you know about that? You're nodding. Where that's
yes, it's a project. The idea came from Inuk Rosing, the geological professor from Greenlandic professor that's situated in Denmark. I know that they've been they have been experimenting it for some years now, but my feeling is that because they get amazing results. I mean, their plant growth is like 28%. I mean, they get 28% bigger plants when they add it to the soil. But then when they found out that it actually captures CO2, they were like, okay, they can see the perspectives and globally to enrich soils that have been worn out across the globe somewhere by just moving this dust somewhere else as when it warms up. And I think is it when it warms up or when it gets non-salty water, then it starts binding carbon CO2. But I know that they're testing it out, and I mean, in my interpretation, there are some people around the world that think it's just too good to be true, because I'm really surprised that it hasn't gone a little bit faster with people investing in the tryouts. But I also realized that, of course, it's not that simple. People want to make sure that if you dumped this dust on the ground, or you dump it in the sea by, dead coral reefs or something, that it's not gonna do something bad for the balance of the local environment. So I know it's ongoing, and there's several companies, which Mini Grossing is also a part of, that are trying to see how, if it can be commercially done, and also for the, yeah. So it's an activism at the same time as it's business.
Yes, that suits the time and the place well. Someone, when I was in Greenland, I asked someone about this. Was it you, Kim, who told me that they found, though, that the rock dust forms like a pretty like impenetrable layer? It ends up forming like a really it's something about the way it settles together is unappealing, unhelpful. Did you tell me that? Someone told me that.
Yeah, it forms basically,
Maybe it was
as Inuk said, it releases phosphorus, which is a very important fertilizer for plants. But at the same time, it's drawing CO2 from dissolved CO2 in the soil, or from water, and forming a mineral form, and locking up that CO2. And in soils, it can create a layer, much like, almost like a cement, which decreases the infiltration of water. So you get more runoff, and you can actually make the system drier rather than wetter, depending upon how much material you've added. So again, this is a broad area called geoengineering, where we're looking at manipulations that might store carbon or draw it from the atmosphere, or stabilize it and lock it away so it can't enter the atmospheric cycle in the future. And all of them have interesting interactions and some potential benefits, but there are many, many ways in which they can also disrupt natural cycles. So it takes a lot of careful thought and some good science to decide whether or not these opportunities exist at some large scale. They may have very good local application, but at large scales, most people are urging caution on this. But people are studying this, and companies are investing in this. That's the reality. And we should be aware of what they're trying to do, in my opinion.
I wonder if I could ask a question. You see in the newspapers, this might be a bit of a departure. There's been a lot of awareness of the extraordinary forest fires in North America and in Russia in the Arctic. A lot of the conversations are, of course, about humidity, dryness, temperature, climate warming. My question to the speakers is, do you think that there is a place for kind of the greening story that should be present in discussions about what's happening with fires? Or do you see them as being sufficiently separate and distinct that they're essentially two different kinds of stories?
Clearly, when you start thinking about particularly the interface between the boreal forest and tundra, that's a very major issue. We are getting drier conditions in those areas. We're getting trees dying. There are more wood boring insects, defoliation. Those boreal forests are much more susceptible to fire than they had been. I mean, we've had temperatures of 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Siberia. So those fires can also transfer into the organic soils in tundra regions. There have been lightning strikes and soil fires, if you will, in Alaska and also in Greenland recently. So fire is going to be an emerging issue, particularly as it relates to carbon release into the atmosphere. And also, we're seeing a lot more black soot black carbon being deposited on snow and ice in the Arctic, and also the Greenland ice sheet from these fires. And it does speed up the melting of ice. So another one of these sort of feedback interactions that tend to bite us in the end if we aren't really thoughtful about how the world's running.
Yeah, and that kind of also emphasizes how, as environments get drier, trees are not a great store of carbon in these environments because they burn, and then that leaves the trees. However, one thing, if you look at the satellite imagery, some of the strongest greening areas occur in regions just after a fire. Because you're kind of starting from, a burned landscape, you see a huge pulse of kind of regrowth of forbs and things like that. So, yeah, unpicking some of the global signal, or at least the northern signal of greening is response to fire.
It's fascinating. Thank you.
I want to just thank the speakers for really showing us the complexity and the heterogeneity of the Arctic and all its particulars that you've given us through your different lenses. I really get a great sense of how complex and provocative greening is in our world, in the Arctic world. Thank you so much, and thank you for the questions. And we hope to have you all back at an event, hopefully in the next semester, as part of the Arctic Environmental Humanities series.